As a 28-year-old financial auditor in Chicago, Clara was adjusting the silk train of her wedding dress when her adoptive father shoved a heavy brass pen and a notarized document into her bare hands. Two Cook County Sheriff deputies immediately stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains of the bridal boutique. Arthur gripped her wrist with bruising force, driving the pen down onto the signature line. The dark ink stained the thick paper before she could even read the header. Arthur snatched the paper back the second her name touched the line. The documents have come into force. He handed the manila folder directly to the taller police officer without breaking eye contact with his daughter. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the quiet room. The boutique manager dropped a silver tray of drinks in pure shock, the sound of shattering champagne glasses piercing the tense silence. Clara stared at the cold metal locking tightly around her wrists. There was no business loan guarantee to help the family store. The pages detailed a massive wire fraud scheme, a $2 million embezzlement operation, systematically draining funds from a vulnerable agricultural charity. Her adoptive brother, Thomas, had orchestrated every fake invoice to fund his underground gambling debts. Yet the confession she just signed bore her official auditor seal and her legally binding signature. It perfectly matched the forged digital trails Thomas had planted on her work laptop for the past 6 months. The funds had been siphoned directly from a JP Chase corporate trust using her security credentials. The deputies shoved her roughly toward the exit. The sharp clack of her high heels dragged against the polished marble floor. Her adoptive mother, Martha, stood near the doorway, refusing to make eye contact. Martha clutched a designer handbag purchased with the stolen charity funds, her expression entirely blank. They were sacrificing her to save their biological son from a federal penitentiary. Her fiancé walked through the glass doors just as the deputies pushed her onto the crowded sidewalk. He saw the handcuffs, the police cruiser, and the grim faces of her adoptive parents. Arthur immediately stepped forward, handing him a printed summary of the fake audit trail. The man she was supposed to marry in 2 weeks scanned the paper, his eyes turning cold. He took one slow step back, deliberately creating physical distance between them. Clara made a deeply controversial choice in that exact second. She did not scream her innocence. She did not fight the officers or beg her fiancé for blind trust. Fighting would only give the police a valid reason to add resisting arrest to her charges, completely sealing her legal fate. She allowed the officers to push her into the back of the cruiser in absolute silence. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the busy city street. The ride to the downtown precinct felt like a slow descent into a mechanical underworld. The vibrant city lights blurred through the wire mesh of the police vehicle. Clara processed the sheer scale of the calculated betrayal. She had spent 10 years handing over every single paycheck to pay off Arthur and Martha's previous bankruptcies. She had skipped meals, worn thrifted clothes, and worked 90-hour weeks to keep a solid roof over their heads. They had demanded eternal gratitude for pulling her out of the foster system when she was a child. In return, they had spent half a year carefully framing her. Arthur had personally handed the district attorney a fabricated diary. The pages contained her handwriting, perfectly forged by Thomas, detailing a lavish lifestyle she never actually lived. They had gathered fake receipts for sports cars and luxury penthouses bought under shell companies bearing her exact initials. They processed her at the police station with brutal efficiency. Fingerprints, mugshots, and the permanent confiscation of her personal belongings stripped away her remaining identity. The heavy iron door of the isolated holding cell clanged shut behind her. The stale air smelled of industrial bleach and deep despair. She sat on the freezing steel bench, staring directly at the cracked concrete wall. True betrayal never comes from enemies standing across a bloody battlefield. It ferments quietly in the hearts of those we share our dining tables with, hiding seamlessly behind warm smiles and borrowed money. We are taught to revere the concept of family as an unbreakable sanctuary, a protective shield against a cruel world. But blood and obligation can quickly become the tightest chains, weaponized by parasites who demand eternal gratitude for providing the bare minimum of basic survival. Justice is rarely a natural law of the universe. It is a harsh structure built from the ashes of broken trust, forged only when the victim decides that survival is no longer enough. To truly balance the scales, one must stop expecting the wicked to suddenly grow a conscience. Retribution requires stepping entirely outside the boundaries of polite morality and embracing the cold, calculated precision of a silent predator. The holding cell remained dim, lit only by a flickering fluorescent bulb on the ceiling. A female inmate sitting in the opposite corner shifted quietly in the heavy shadows. The stranger reached into her uniform pocket and slowly slid a small, black burner phone across the damp concrete floor. The illicit device spun to a halt right at the tip of Clara's shoe. "You have one call before they move you to maximum security," the stranger whispered, her voice rough like sandpaper. Clara stared down at the glowing screen. She was not going to call a useless public defender. She knew exactly which hidden corporate backdoor she had left open in Arthur's financial servers. The burner phone felt like a block of ice against Clara's palm. The screen glowed with a harsh blue light, illuminating the grime on the cell floor. She did not waste time with tears or prayers. Her fingers moved with practiced precision across the small keypad, entering a string of 12 alphanumeric characters. This was the hidden tunnel she had built into Arthur's private server during a late-night maintenance session 3 months ago. The stranger in the corner watched her with unblinking eyes, her face half hidden by the shadow of the steel bunk. Clara ignored the woman and focused on the flickering data stream. The server was a digital graveyard of ethical failures. Within seconds, she located the primary ledger for the Vance family estate. Arthur and Thomas had not just stolen from the charity. They had linked her social security number to a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. Every cent of the $2 million had been moved through this ghost entity. Her adoptive parents had effectively turned her entire legal existence into a human shield. If the FBI followed the money, every trail stopped at her doorstep. The sheer clinical nature of their cruelty made the air in the cell feel thin. She tapped a final command, setting a silent recursive script to copy the encrypted logs to a secure cloud drive. The heavy iron slide on the cell door groaned open before the transfer reached 50%. Clara shoved the burner phone deep into the waistband of her prison uniform just as a guard stepped into the light. A man in a charcoal gray suit stood behind the officer, holding a leather briefcase. He was Marcus Thorne, the primary legal fixer for the Vance family's business interests. Marcus entered the cell and signaled the guard to close the door. He did not offer a handshake or a seat. He leaned against the damp wall, his expression one of professional pity. Marcus pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. It was a pre-written confession and a waiver of her right to a public defender. The lawyer spoke in a low, rhythmic tone that sounded like a funeral dirge. He explained that Arthur and Martha were heartbroken, but felt they had no other choice. They were offering her a deal. If she signed the full confession now, they would provide a private trust fund for her use after her release. They promised she would serve less than 5 years in a minimum security facility. Clara stared at the document, noting the predatory language hidden in the fine print. The deal was a trap designed to prevent her from ever speaking in court. If she signed, she admitted to acting alone, completely insulating Thomas and Arthur from federal prosecution. She was being offered a comfortable cage in exchange for her silence and her soul. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes as cold as the steel bench beneath her. She made another controversial choice that would determine the next decade of her life. She did not argue the facts or plead for a better deal. She calmly took the pen from his hand and drew a single, thick black line through the entire document. She handed the ruined paper back to him without a word. Marcus Thorne's professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened, and he shoved the paper back into his briefcase. He warned her that without this deal, the district attorney would seek the maximum penalty. She was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. He turned and signaled the guard to let him out. The cell door slammed shut with a finality that vibrated in Clara's teeth. The stranger in the shadows let out a dry, hacking laugh. She told Clara that the Vance family had already paid for a specific cell in the general population. They weren't just sending her to prison. They were sending her to a place where she wouldn't survive the first week. Clara pulled the burner phone back out. The data transfer was complete. She had the evidence of the shell company, but she needed a way to broadcast it without being intercepted. She realized that Arthur had already frozen her bank accounts and canceled her credit cards. She was a ghost in the financial system she had spent her life protecting. The silence of the prison night was heavy and suffocating. Every distant shout and metallic bang echoed like a hammer against a coffin. Clara sat back on the steel bench, her mind racing through thousands of lines of code and financial regulations. She was no longer a bride or a daughter. She was a professional auditor hunting for a fatal flaw in a corrupt machine. In the shadows of a broken life, we often discover that the walls meant to imprison us are actually the boundaries of our new kingdom. We spend years building structures of loyalty and love, believing they will shelter us from the storms of existence. Yet, when the foundation crumbles, we realize that the most dangerous architects are often the ones who tucked us into bed at night. True strength is not found in the absence of betrayal, but in the calculated response to it. To survive the darkness, one must become more than a victim of circumstance. One must become a student of the very cruelty that sought to destroy them. Justice is not a gift granted by the merciful, it is a weapon seized by the persistent. When the world tries to erase your name, you must write it in the one place they cannot reach. Only in the total loss of everything do we find the absolute freedom to burn the old world down and build something unbreakable from the smoke. The burner phone buzzed once in her hand. It was an incoming text from an unknown number in New York City. The message contained only a single address and a time. It was the location of the private jet terminal at O'Hare International Airport. Thomas was planning to flee the country in 6 hours, taking the remaining charity funds with him. The battery icon on the burner phone blinked red, signaling less than 15% power remaining. 6 hours was not enough time to rely on the slow, bureaucratic wheels of the standard justice system. If Thomas successfully boarded that private jet, the $2 million would permanently disappear into untraceable international waters. Her only tangible leverage would evaporate forever, leaving her to rot in a concrete box. She stared at the unknown New York number, realizing this was a lifeline thrown by an unseen player. Someone out there wanted the Vance family destroyed just as much as she did. Her thumbs flew across the tiny plastic keyboard with desperate precision. She did not ask for the sender's identity or offer a pathetic plea for rescue. She was done playing the helpless victim. Instead, she extracted a single encrypted string of routing data from the Cayman Islands ledger and sent it into the digital void. She attached a brief, uncompromising text demanding an immediate federal tactical intervention at the airport in exchange for the complete decryption key. She hit send and waited in the suffocating silence. Heavy leather boots echoed down the concrete corridor, instantly breaking her intense focus. It was not the rhythmic, casual stroll of a guard on a standard night patrol. The footsteps were fast, deliberate, and accompanied by the chilling metallic scrape of a heavy baton dragging against the steel bars. The female inmate in the opposite corner retreated further into the deep shadows, pulling her thin, scratchy blanket completely over her head. The brutal hit Arthur had paid for was happening tonight. A massive guard with a thick neck and a name tag reading Miller stopped abruptly in front of her cell. He did not bother turning on the overhead fluorescent lights. He slid the heavy iron door open just enough to step inside, his thick knuckles turning white around the grip of his weapon. "Stand up right now," Miller growled, stepping into the dim light. "There was a paperwork error with your booking. You are moving to the deep block immediately." Clara did not move from the freezing steel bench. She recognized Officer Miller instantly, her sharp auditor's memory pulling his file from the archives of her mind. 3 years ago, she had audited the local police union's pension fund and noticed his catastrophic gambling debts, along with his wife's severely underwater mortgage. She looked down at the glowing burner phone, her mind making a deeply controversial and highly illegal decision. She was no longer playing by the ethical rules of a certified public accountant. She accessed Arthur's offshore shell company using the recursive backdoor script she had just established. With 3 rapid, calculated taps, she initiated an irreversible wire transfer of $50,000 directly from the stolen agricultural charity funds into Miller's personal bank account. She turned the glowing screen toward the corrupt officer just as he raised the heavy wooden baton to strike her collarbone. "Look at the screen, Miller," Clara whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying, absolute calmness. "Your mortgage is completely paid off. But if you touch me, my dead man switch forwards the exact transaction details to internal affairs." Miller froze in midair, his wide eyes reading his own highly classified routing numbers flashing rapidly on the illicit device. The heavy baton slowly lowered to the damp concrete floor, hitting the ground with a dull, defeated thud. The silence in the dim cell was absolute, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of the terrified guard. He was a ruthless predator who had just realized he was locked in a cage with a highly venomous snake. Clara ordered him to manually enter a federal hold status into the precinct's mainframe, so no local cop could move her. Miller backed away slowly, his tough, intimidating facade crumbling into pure panic. He nodded silently, securing the heavy iron door before rushing down the dark corridor to manipulate the internal system. Clara leaned against the cold, cracked wall, feeling the massive rush of adrenaline mix perfectly with the bitter taste of her own corrupted morality. She had just committed blatant wire fraud, successfully bribed a law enforcement officer, and weaponized stolen charity money just to save her own skin. Morality is a fragile luxury, reserved entirely for those who have never been pushed to the absolute edge of a bottomless abyss. We are systematically conditioned to believe that the righteous path is always paved with strict adherence to the law, even when the law is actively participating in our unjust destruction. But when the very systems designed to protect you are bought and sold by the monsters seeking your ruin, playing by the rules is nothing more than a quiet, polite form of suicide. Survival demands a terrible and irreversible evolution, forcing the innocent to forge dangerous weapons from the exact same dark materials used by their oppressors. To defeat a corrupt machine, you cannot simply stand before it with empty hands and a pure heart. You must be completely willing to reach into the grinding gears, cover your hands in the thick grease of their sins, and tear the engine apart from the inside. True justice is rarely clean, and reclaiming your life often requires stepping into the shadows and becoming the nightmare your enemies never saw coming. The burner phone vibrated violently against her bruised thigh. The unknown New York contact had finally responded to her encrypted leverage. The text message was brutally short, entirely professional, and chillingly specific. Federal agents were currently surrounding the private aviation terminal at O'Hare, but Thomas was not the only passenger listed on the flight manifest. Her adoptive mother, Martha, was already sitting on board the aircraft with a locked briefcase. The battery indicator on the burner phone flatlined, dropping to 0% just as she finished reading the message about Martha. The screen went completely black, mirroring the suffocating darkness of the holding cell. Clara slid the dead device back under the steel bunk, leaving it near the sleeping inmate. She leaned her head against the cold concrete wall, perfectly calculating the exact geographical distance between the downtown precinct and O'Hare International Airport. It would take federal agents less than 20 minutes to breach the private hangar. Arthur Vance thought he had meticulously orchestrated the perfect scapegoat. He had sent his spoiled son and his complicit wife on a private jet to a non-extradition country, leaving his adopted daughter to take the devastating fall. He believed he was entirely untouchable, sitting safely in his sprawling Lake Forest mansion. He was about to experience the terrifying velocity of a meticulously planned financial audit turning into a targeted federal raid. A sudden, sharp metallic clang echoed through the corridor. The heavy iron door of her cell did not open. Instead, a grim-faced federal marshal approached the reinforced bars, completely ignoring the nervous local precinct guards hovering behind him. He unclipped a heavy set of master keys from his tactical belt and slid the cell door open with a screeching groan of rusted hinges. "Clara Vance," the marshal stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are being transferred immediately to federal custody under the direct order of the United States Attorney's Office in New York." She stood up slowly, her muscles stiff from hours of sitting on the freezing steel bench. The marshal stepped forward, surprisingly gentle as he unlocked the heavy police cuffs, clamping her wrists and replaced them with standard federal restraints. As he tightened the metal around her bruised skin, he leaned in incredibly close. He muttered that her anonymous tip had been highly lucrative. The walk from the holding cell to the armored federal transport vehicle was a surreal blur of flashing blue lights and silent, heavily armed tactical units. The local police captain stood near the precinct exit, his face a mask of total confusion and barely concealed panic as he watched his high-profile prisoner slip entirely out of his jurisdiction. Clara maintained a stoic, expressionless face. She had successfully bypassed Arthur's localized corruption network. The armored transport rumbled to life, the heavy diesel engine vibrating through the bolted steel floor. She sat alone in the reinforced back compartment, staring through the thick, wire mesh window as the city skyline slowly drifted past. The vehicle did not head toward the federal courthouse. Instead, it merged onto the Kennedy Expressway, accelerating violently toward the northern suburbs. They were heading directly toward Arthur's mansion. The unknown contact in New York was not just trying to intercept the stolen funds at the airport. They were simultaneously executing a synchronized, brutal takedown of the entire Vance family operation. Clara closed her eyes, visualizing the precise moment the federal agents would smash through Arthur's custom mahogany front doors. She wanted to witness the exact second his arrogant, untouchable facade shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The armored truck came to a sudden, jarring halt. The heavy back doors swung open, revealing the sprawling, manicured lawns of the Lake Forest estate bathed in the harsh, chaotic glow of dozens of tactical strobe lights. Federal agents swarmed the luxurious property like angry hornets. The massive front doors of the mansion were already splintered and broken off their hinges. Two federal marshals escorted Clara out of the vehicle and walked her straight up the sweeping stone driveway. The crisp night air smelled faintly of expensive pine and impending legal doom. Arthur Vance was standing on his pristine front porch, fully dressed in his custom Italian silk pajamas. He was surrounded by 4 heavily armed agents, his face completely drained of color. He looked like an old, pathetic man who had just realized his entire empire was built on a foundation of gasoline and matches. He locked eyes with Clara as she approached, his expression twisting from utter shock to pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged forward against the agents holding his arms, screaming that she was an ungrateful parasite who had destroyed the only family that ever loved her. He yelled that he would spend every last cent of his remaining fortune, ensuring she died in a federal cage. The lead agent standing next to Clara calmly pulled a thick stack of printed financial logs from his tactical vest. He shoved the documents directly into Arthur's chest. "You don't have any fortune left, Mr. Vance," the agent said clearly, his voice carrying over the chaotic noise of the raid. "Every offshore account connected to your Cayman Islands shell company was systematically frozen 10 minutes ago. Revenge is rarely a sudden, explosive act of violence. True vengeance is a meticulous, mathematical deconstruction of the enemy's entire existence. We are taught to forgive and forget, to turn the other cheek, and to leave the ultimate judgment to the slow, unreliable hands of fate. But fate is often blind, and forgiveness is a luxury reserved for those who have not been systematically targeted for absolute destruction. When the very people who offered you shelter are the ones secretly tearing down the walls to let the wolves inside, passive survival becomes a terminal disease. Retribution requires a cold, architectural precision, an unwavering commitment to dismantle their empire brick by bloody brick. It is the understanding that true justice is not a balanced scale, but a devastating avalanche triggered by a single, perfectly placed stone. To truly break the cycle of abuse, the victim must become the architect of a new reality, one where the wicked are finally forced to consume the very poison they so eagerly served to others. Arthur stared at the printed logs, his hands trembling violently as he recognized his own encrypted routing numbers. He slowly dropped to his knees on the cold, hard stone of his front porch, his breathing shallow and erratic. Clara looked down at the man who had ordered her execution just a few hours ago. The marshals gently tugged her arm, guiding her back toward the armored transport. She turned away from Arthur, finally noticing Marcus Thorne, the family's legal fixer, sitting in the back of a black SUV. The tinted window of the black SUV rolled down with a soft, electric hum, revealing Marcus Thorne sitting comfortably in the plush leather backseat. He was not wearing federal handcuffs, nor was he sweating under the harsh glare of the tactical strobe lights illuminating the shattered remnants of Arthur Vance's empire. Instead, the corporate fixer was calmly sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the old patriarch being shoved into a heavily armored transport. The federal marshals did not drag Clara back to the prison truck. They walked her directly to the idling SUV, opened the heavy armored door, and stepped aside, treating the vehicle like a mobile command center rather than a suspect's car. Clara slid onto the smooth leather seat, the cold rain just beginning to tap against the reinforced glass. The heavy door slammed shut, instantly silencing the chaotic symphony of shouting agents and barking police dogs outside. Marcus tapped the screen of a slim silver tablet, illuminating his sharp features in the dim cabin. He did not offer an apology for the fake confession he had tried to force upon her just 3 hours ago in the damp holding cell. He simply turned the glowing screen toward her, revealing a live satellite feed of the private aviation terminal at O'Hare International Airport. The grainy night vision footage showed a sleek Gulfstream jet surrounded by 8 heavily armed federal tactical vehicles. Clara watched with cold satisfaction as her adoptive brother, Thomas, was dragged forcefully down the aluminum air stairs, his face pressed harshly against the wet tarmac. A few seconds later, her adoptive mother, Martha, emerged from the cabin, screaming hysterically while clutching the silver briefcase tightly to her chest. A federal agent effortlessly pried the heavy briefcase from her manicured hands, snapping the metallic locks open to reveal neatly stacked bricks of $100 bills. The stolen agricultural charity funds had been fully recovered before the landing gear could ever retract. Marcus set the tablet face down on the center console, resting his hands gracefully on his tailored knees. "The New York Attorney General sends her deepest regards," he murmured, his voice incredibly smooth and completely devoid of hostility. The sudden realization hit Clara like a physical blow to the ribs. Marcus had never truly been loyal to Arthur Vance. The expensive legal fixer was actually a highly embedded federal informant, a brilliant Trojan horse planted deep inside the corrupt family structure to map out their entire money laundering network. He was the unknown contact who had texted her the burner phone instructions. Arthur had paid Marcus a massive legal retainer for 5 years, entirely unaware that he was funding the exact architect of his own inevitable destruction. However, the federal investigation had stalled precisely because Arthur insulated himself with multiple layers of plausible deniability, using Clara's legitimate auditing credentials as an unbreakable shield. They needed the perfect catalyst to force Arthur into making a desperate, sloppy mistake. Framing Clara for the massive embezzlement was the fatal error they had been patiently waiting for, but they needed her to provide the final encrypted keys to legally bypass the strict offshore privacy laws. Clara stared at the heavy rain sliding down the dark window, processing the sheer magnitude of the psychological manipulation. She had been a naive pawn on a massive chessboard, moved entirely against her will by 2 opposing forces of ruthless predators. Yet, she was the only pawn that had successfully managed to flip the entire board and checkmate the king. Marcus reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope, placing it gently on the leather console between them. It was not another legally binding confession or a threat of a maximum security prison sentence. He explained that the federal prosecutors had officially dropped all pending criminal charges against her, granting her full immunity in exchange for her spontaneous and highly valuable cooperation. But the thick envelope contained something far more dangerous than simple legal freedom. It was an extremely lucrative employment contract from a shadow division of the Treasury Department. They did not just want her to testify against Arthur and Thomas in open federal court. They wanted her uniquely corrupted skill set, her intimate knowledge of dark money networks, and her demonstrated willingness to brutally weaponize financial data without hesitation. Clara looked at the unsealed envelope, fully understanding the permanent implication of opening it. If she walked away right now, she could quietly rebuild her shattered life as a standard corporate accountant, forever hiding from the terrifying ghosts of her past. If she signed the official contract, she would become a permanent resident of the criminal underworld she had just barely escaped, hunting down men far more dangerous than her adoptive father. She reached out with trembling fingers, picked up the silver pen resting next to the envelope, and signed her name on the dotted line without reading a single legal clause. Marcus smiled for the very first time, a sharp, predatory expression that silently confirmed she had just sold her soul to a much higher bidder. He tapped the thick glass partition, signaling the silent driver to pull away from the burning wreckage of the Vance estate. The heavy SUV accelerated smoothly onto the dark, rain-slicked highway, leaving the flashing blue lights far behind in the rearview mirror. Clara leaned back against the headrest, closing her eyes as the rhythmic hum of the tires lulled her racing heart. She was completely free from the suffocating grip of her fake family, but she had eagerly traded her invisible chains for a terrifyingly sharp sword. Freedom is rarely a peaceful transition from darkness into light. It is frequently a violent renegotiation of the terms of your own captivity. We are culturally conditioned to celebrate the moment the physical shackles are finally broken, believing that liberation inherently brings profound spiritual peace and total moral clarity. However, the deepest scars inflicted by betrayal do not magically heal just because the immediate oppressor has been vanquished and locked away. True survival leaves an indelible mark on the soul, fundamentally altering the victim's entire perception of right and wrong. When you are forced to navigate the treacherous depths of absolute corruption just to stay alive, you cannot simply return to the naive innocence of the surface. You must critically choose whether to remain a helpless civilian waiting for the next inevitable attack, or to fully embrace the darkness, becoming the apex predator that haunts the nightmares of those who dare to cross your path. 6 months dissolved into the cold, sanitized corridors of a subterranean Treasury Department facility beneath Washington. Clara Vance no longer existed in the public registry. She was now a ghost, an operative wielding federal authority and classified decryption algorithms. The naive auditor who cried over a ruined wedding dress was completely dead, replaced by a meticulously calibrated weapon of financial destruction. Marcus Thorne sat across from her in the secure briefing room, projecting a holographic financial web onto the frosted glass wall. The glowing web connected Arthur Vance's frozen Cayman Islands accounts to a much larger, darker entity. Arthur was never the true mastermind. He was merely a convenient, disposable middleman for Julian Croft, a ruthless billionaire venture capitalist who used agricultural charities as a massive laundry machine for international arms dealers. Croft was the unseen puppeteer who had directly ordered the brutal prison hit on Clara when she threatened to expose the local ledger. He had authorized the transfer of $2 million, but his own illicit empire moved tens of billions in a single afternoon across unregulated global markets. Marcus handed her a sleek, black invitation printed on heavy cardstock. Julian Croft was hosting an exclusive high society fundraiser at his private estate in Virginia that exact evening. It was a grotesque display of immense wealth, built entirely on the shattered lives of innocent people. Marcus explained the parameters of her very first official field assignment. She was not there to arrest him. She was there to digitally bleed him dry, to cripple his offshore infrastructure so severely that his dangerous clients would turn on him before the government ever fired a weapon. Clara stepped out of the black government vehicle wearing a stunning crimson evening gown that cost more than her entire college tuition. The heavy silk rustled gracefully against the polished marble steps of the Croft estate. She bypassed the sprawling ballroom, completely ignoring the clinking crystal glasses, the expensive string quartet, and the hypocritical laughter of the political elite. The heavily armed security detail did not give her a second glance, their highly trained eyes easily fooled by the forged diplomatic credentials Marcus had seamlessly embedded in her digital profile. She slipped unnoticed into the private East Wing, her high heels completely silent on the thick Persian carpet. The air grew noticeably colder as she approached Croft's personal study. The heavy oak door was secured by a biometric retinal scanner, a military-grade lock designed to keep federal agencies completely blind. Clara did not bother trying to hack the sophisticated optical sensor. She pulled a small, incredibly thin polymer strip from her evening clutch. Marcus had procured the exact physical impression of Croft's thumbprint from a discarded champagne flute an hour earlier. She pressed the polymer against the manual override panel hidden beneath the heavy brass handle. The lock clicked open with a satisfying, metallic snap. The study was dark, illuminated only by the massive wall of glowing server racks pulsing with a rhythmic, hypnotic blue light. This was the beating heart of Julian Croft's entire criminal empire. Clara sat down at the heavy mahogany desk, her fingers dancing across the smooth glass keyboard of the master terminal. She bypassed the first 3 firewalls with ruthless efficiency, deploying the aggressive Treasury Department algorithms like a swarm of angry locusts. But Julian Croft was not a foolish local businessman like her adoptive father. His private network was protected by an active artificial intelligence that immediately detected her intrusion. The screen suddenly flashed a violent crimson red, initiating a total system lockdown. The heavy steel shutters slammed down over the study windows, sealing her inside the freezing room. Clara made a deeply controversial and dangerous choice in that suffocating darkness. Protocol dictated that she immediately disconnect her drive and abort the mission to avoid physical capture. But retreating meant leaving Croft's financial armor completely intact. Instead of pulling her encrypted flash drive, she actively triggered the facility's internal thermal override system. She deliberately disabled the massive cooling fans regulating the towering server racks, forcing the highly overclocked processors to critically overheat in a matter of minutes. The servers began to scream, emitting a high-pitched, mechanical whine as the internal temperatures spiked violently. The plastic casings started to melt, filling the sealed room with the toxic, acrid smell of burning wiring. She was literally burning his empire to the ground from the inside, fully risking death by smoke inhalation just to ensure every single terabyte of his dark money logs was permanently destroyed. She typed the final command sequence, locking the heavy server doors so his security team could not stop the localized meltdown. Power is an intoxicating illusion carefully constructed by those who have never faced an opponent willing to burn alongside them. Society is structured around a fragile agreement of self-preservation, a mutual understanding that no sane individual will willingly walk into a raging fire just to ensure their enemy turns to ash. But the elite drastically underestimate the terrifying resolve of a survivor who has lost everything that tethered them to normal human fear. When you strip a person of their fundamental belief in justice, you do not create a defeated victim. You forge a weapon entirely immune to the standard deterrence of pain and consequence. True dominance is not measured by the thickness of your vault doors. It is determined by your absolute willingness to sacrifice your own safety to guarantee the total annihilation of the monsters hiding in the dark. Retribution is a sacred fire, and the only way to cleanse a corrupted world is to calmly breathe in the smoke. The heavy oak door of the study violently shuddered as Croft's security team began attacking it with a heavy steel battering ram. The temperature in the sealed room was rapidly becoming unbearable, the melting servers creating a thick, blinding fog of toxic black smoke. Clara calmly pulled a small, specialized respiratory mask from her clutch and pressed it tightly against her face. She stepped back into the deepest shadows of the burning room, waiting for the heavy door to finally splinter open. The heavy oak door finally surrendered with a violent, splintering crash. The massive steel battering ram had sheared the hinges clean off the frame, sending the reinforced wood toppling into the thick, toxic fog filling the study. Julian Croft stepped into the room before the dust could even settle, flanked by 4 tactical guards wearing high-end carbon filtration masks. He was not the panicked, disheveled man Clara had expected. He was wearing a sharp charcoal tuxedo, his eyes as cold and calculating as a deep-sea predator. He looked at the melting server racks, the glowing blue heart of his financial empire now a twisted heap of scorched plastic and liquid copper. "You have a remarkable talent for destruction, Clara," Julian said. His voice amplified and distorted through the external speakers of his respirator. He did not sound angry. He sounded impressed, the way a scientist might admire a particularly lethal virus. He stepped over a smoldering pile of burnt cables, his polished leather shoes crunching against the glass shards littering the floor. He stopped exactly 5 paces away from the desk where Clara stood, the crimson silk of her gown glowing like a fresh wound in the heavy black smoke. Clara did not flinch or reach for a weapon. She held her evening clutch with both hands, her posture perfectly erect despite the searing heat radiating from the dying servers. She looked Julian Croft in the eyes, her gaze devoid of the fear he was accustomed to seeing in his victims. She informed him that the thermal override was not a desperate act of sabotage. It was a time diversion. While his security team was busy battering down the door, her automated script had finished broadcasting the decrypted routing numbers of his primary weapons clients to every major intelligence agency in the Western Hemisphere. Julian's eyes narrowed for the first time, the calm mask finally beginning to crack around the edges. He was no longer just losing money. He was losing his protection. Without the absolute secrecy of his network, he was merely a man with a lot of useless paper and a target on his back that stretched across 4 continents. He signaled his guards to move in and seize her. He wanted her kept alive just long enough to see if she had a master override key hidden somewhere in her mind. The lead guard lunged forward, reaching for her throat with a gloved hand. Clara did not wait for the impact. She dropped a small, heavy glass vial she had been concealing in the palm of her hand. The vial shattered against the stone floor, releasing a concentrated cloud of high-density, incapacitating gas. It was a specialized compound Marcus had provided, designed to penetrate standard carbon filters within seconds. The guards collapsed almost instantly, their bodies hitting the floor with heavy, uncoordinated thuds. Julian stumbled backward, his hand grasping at the edge of the mahogany desk for balance. His expensive respirator was failing, his lungs burning as the chemical agent bypassed the seals. He stared at Clara in pure, unadulterated shock. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, moving with the terrifying grace of a ghost. She leaned in close, her voice a low, chilling whisper that vibrated through the dying hum of the room. She told him that she had learned everything she knew about cruelty from the family he had helped to destroy. She did not kill him. She did not even strike him. She simply reached into his tuxedo pocket and removed his encrypted master phone. Without his biometric signature and that device, he was effectively locked out of his own emergency escape protocols. She turned her back on the choking billionaire and walked toward the heavy steel shutters she had closed earlier. She tapped a hidden manual release valve she had located while waiting in the dark. The shutters groaned open, letting in a sudden, violent rush of cold Virginia night air. Clara stepped out onto the wide stone balcony, the wind whipping her crimson dress around her legs like a banner of war. Far below on the sweeping driveway, the local police were finally beginning to arrive, their sirens, a distant, lonely wail against the sound of the wind. She checked the small, glowing screen of Julian's phone. Marcus Thorne was already waiting at the perimeter fence in a high-speed extraction vehicle. But she noticed a final, unsent message on the device that stopped her heart for a split second. The message was addressed to a private security firm in Chicago. It contained a single high-resolution photograph of the apartment building where her biological mother had been hiding for the past 20 years. The Vance family had lied to her about everything, including the fact that she was never actually an orphan. Julian Croft had been holding her true heritage as a final, devastating insurance policy. The betrayal did not end with her adoptive parents. It reached back into a past she had never been allowed to own. A trap is not merely a physical enclosure designed to restrict your movement. It is a complex psychological architecture built upon the foundation of your own deepest desires and unhealed wounds. We spend our lives running from the ghosts of our past, believing that if we acquire enough power or distance, the shadows can never catch us. Yet, the most effective predators do not hunt you with brute force. They study the jagged edges of your broken heart and weave a web from the very threads of your own hope. True liberation requires more than just burning down the prison your enemies built for you. It demands the terrifying courage to stare into the abyss of your own identity and accept that the person you were meant to be was stolen before you could even speak your own name. Justice is a cold, lonely road, and the further you walk it, the more you realize that every victory carries a price paid in the currency of your own innocence. To truly win, you must be willing to lose the one thing you are fighting to save. The balcony felt incredibly high and isolated, the world below a chaotic blur of blue and red lights. Clara looked at the photograph of the woman who shared her eyes, a woman she had never known existed. She shoved the phone into her clutch and vaulted over the stone railing, sliding down a thick, decorative ivy trellis with practiced, athletic precision. She hit the ground running, disappearing into the dark tree line just as the first tactical teams breached the balcony. She was no longer just an operative or an auditor. She was a daughter searching for a ghost. The damp earth of the Virginia woods swallowed the sound of Clara's footsteps as she sprinted toward the perimeter fence. Marcus Thorne was leaning against the matte black extraction vehicle, checking a luminous tactical watch with clear impatience. She bypassed the passenger door entirely, grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive raincoat, and shoved Julian Croft's encrypted master phone directly against his chest. The heavy rain washed the scent of smoke and burning plastic from her crimson evening gown. Marcus grabbed her wrists instinctively, his flawless professional demeanor fracturing under the sudden, aggressive physical assault. He demanded an immediate explanation as to why she had deviated from the strict federal extraction protocol and left their primary target alive in a burning room. Clara did not attempt to justify her tactical choices or beg for his bureaucratic understanding. She forcefully tapped the shattered screen of the stolen device, displaying the high-resolution photograph of the dilapidated Chicago apartment building and the active mercenary contract. The federal handler stepped back, warning her in a low, dangerous tone that deviating from the Treasury Department's sanctioned mission parameters would instantly nullify her hard-earned immunity agreement. She would immediately transition from a protected government asset to an active federal fugitive, hunted by the exact agency she had just sworn loyalty to. Clara stared at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet trees behind them. She stated with absolute, terrifying clarity that she was going to Chicago tonight, and if he attempted to delay her, she would broadcast their classified offshore surveillance algorithms directly to the dark web. Marcus studied her cold, unflinching eyes, silently recognizing the terrifying, uncontrollable evolution he had accidentally catalyzed by bringing her into this shadow world. He slowly released his grip on her wrists, stepping back to open the reinforced passenger door of the armored vehicle. The high-speed drive to the private airfield was suffocatingly silent, punctuated only by the rhythmic squeak of the heavy windshield wipers cutting through the torrential downpour. Clara spent the entire agonizing flight to Illinois completely dismantling Julian's phone, extracting the exact tactical deployment schedule of the private security contractors. The gritty, unforgiving streets of Chicago felt drastically different than they had just 6 short months ago. The sleek federal transport dropped her 2 blocks away from the target address, deep within the forgotten, decaying industrial sector of the city. Bitter rain lashed against the cracked pavement, flickering neon signs bleeding vibrant, toxic colors into the murky puddles. She pulled the heavy collar of her tactical jacket up against the biting wind, leaving her expensive crimson gown abandoned in a federal trash bin somewhere in Virginia. The targeted apartment building was a decaying brick monolith, its iron fire escapes heavily rusted and its primary security doors hanging loosely off their broken hinges. Clara bypassed the main entrance completely, climbing the slippery metal grate of the rear fire escape with a practiced, desperate agility. She reached the 4th-floor landing, pressing her back flat against the damp, freezing brick wall. The window of apartment 402 was entirely dark, but the faint, erratic beam of a tactical flashlight swept rapidly across the peeling floral wallpaper inside. Julian Croft's highly paid private mercenaries had already breached the perimeter. Clara drew the compact, heavily suppressed firearm Marcus had reluctantly handed her before they parted ways on the cold tarmac. She did not know if she possessed the dark psychological capacity to actually take a human life. But the polite rules of corporate auditing no longer applied in this violent, underground world. She carefully slid the rusted window frame upward, the screeching metal perfectly masked by a sudden, violent clap of thunder rolling across the city skyline. She slipped into the stifling apartment, her thick tactical boots completely silent on the rotting wooden floorboards. A massive mercenary in heavy, unmarked body armor was aggressively tearing apart a small wooden dresser, shoving faded family photographs and worn medical documents into a black canvas bag. Clara could have easily waited for heavily armed federal backup, preserving her own legal safety and maintaining a fragile moral high ground. Instead, she stepped out of the deep shadows, raised her weapon with absolute precision, and coldly shot the heavy tactical flashlight right out of the mercenary's hand. The man grunted in pure shock, dropping the canvas bag as the shattered flashlight plunged the cramped room into almost total darkness. He spun around violently, his right hand reaching for his own holstered weapon, but Clara was already moving forward. She closed the distance with terrifying speed, driving the heavy steel barrel of her suppressed pistol directly under his armored chin. The sharp metallic click of the hammer pulling back echoed like a deafening explosion in the tiny, dead silent room, completely freezing the massive soldier in his tracks. Blood is often romanticized as the thickest, most unbreakable bond of human existence, a mystical connection that supposedly transcends time and calculated deception. However, the reality of biology is frequently far more sinister, serving as the ultimate leverage for monsters who understand that our deepest vulnerability is our desperate need to belong. When your entire identity has been systematically engineered by liars, the search for truth stops being a journey of emotional healing and becomes a brutal act of war. You cannot peacefully reclaim a stolen history from those who have built their empires on your deliberate erasure. To rescue the ghost of your past, you must willingly sever the fragile threads of your own humanity, accepting that the hands meant to hold your mother must first be covered in the blood of her captors. True vengeance is a solitary, consuming fire that requires you to sacrifice the very soul you are trying to piece back together. The mercenary froze completely, his heavy breathing loud and erratic against the freezing steel pressed tightly to his throat. Clara demanded to know exactly where they had taken the innocent woman who lived in this apartment. The man let out a dry, rattling laugh, a sickening sound, completely devoid of any rational fear. He whispered in the dark that they were far too late, but they did not take her mother away. He slowly tilted his head toward the open closet door, where a pristine, white wedding dress hung perfectly illuminated by the distant amber streetlights. The white silk of the wedding dress glowed with a spectral, haunting luminescence in the dim amber light filtering through the dirty, rain-streaked window. It was not just a random, off-the-rack gown purchased for a psychological scare. Clara instantly recognized the intricate French lace patterns and the specific, hand-stitched pearl embroidery cascading down the bodice. It was the exact custom dress she had been wearing 6 months ago when Arthur Vance had her violently arrested in the upscale bridal boutique. The level of psychological warfare was absolutely staggering. Julian Croft had meticulously placed this agonizing symbol of her deepest, most humiliating trauma inside her biological mother's closet to completely shatter her mental focus and trigger a paralyzing emotional response. The massive mercenary felt her grip on the suppressed pistol loosen for a fraction of a second as she stared blindly at the pristine gown. He immediately seized the microscopic opening, surging upward with terrifying speed. He drove his heavy, armored elbow toward her unprotected ribs, while his right hand reached frantically for a jagged combat knife strapped to his tactical vest. But Clara had spent the last 6 months training under extreme duress with the most ruthless operators in the Treasury Department's Shadow Division. She did not panic, and she certainly did not retreat. She sidestepped his brutal strike with calculated, fluid precision, bringing the heavy steel grip of her weapon down violently against the vulnerable base of his skull. The mercenary collapsed like a severed puppet, his heavy armor hitting the rotting floorboards in absolute heavy unconsciousness. She immediately secured his thick wrists and ankles with heavy-duty industrial zip ties pulled directly from his own tactical belt, ensuring he would not wake up and violently interfere with her investigation. The cramped, decaying apartment was suffocatingly quiet, smelling faintly of old dried lavender and stale, cheap cigarette smoke. Clara approached the open closet, her breathing shallow and strictly controlled. She reached out and touched the delicate, freezing lace of the wedding dress. It was completely, absurdly out of place in the dilapidated room. hanging heavily on a reinforced wooden hanger. She ran her hands meticulously down the thick silk train, pressing against the heavy fabric until she felt a rigid, rectangular object sewn seamlessly into the inner lining of the hem. Clara pulled a small, razor-sharp tactical blade from her boot and carefully sliced open the expensive white silk, entirely destroying the garment that once represented her naive hopes for a normal future. She extracted a worn, heavy leather-bound journal, wrapped tightly in multiple layers of waterproof plastic. This was clearly not a frightened victim's desperate diary. It was a meticulously detailed, handwritten forensic accounting ledger dating back over 2 full decades. As she rapidly flipped through the yellowed, brittle pages using the mercenary's discarded tactical flashlight, the horrifying, unvarnished truth of her entire origin finally crystallized. Her biological mother was never a helpless captive hiding in fear from Julian Croft. She had been his original chief financial officer, the brilliant, ruthless architect who initially designed his impenetrable offshore laundering network. The meticulously handwritten entries detailed massive, highly illegal arms transfers, untraceable political bribes, and silent corporate assassinations spanning the entire globe. The final, heavily inked entry, dated exactly 28 years ago, calmly explained the devastating, cold-blooded choice the woman had made. She had discovered Julian was planning to assassinate her to completely secure the dark network's permanent secrecy. To guarantee her newborn daughter's physical survival, she had surrendered the child to Arthur Vance, a low-level, ambitious local associate, along with enough encrypted blackmail material to ensure Arthur would raise her. Her mother had intentionally orchestrated the entire abusive, loveless adoption, willingly trading her child's emotional happiness for a beating pulse, and then disappeared into the forgotten, industrial slums of Chicago to serve as a silent, lifelong guardian of the master ledger. Clara stared at the faded blue ink, the profound, crushing weight of the revelation destroying the last remaining microscopic fragments of her civilian innocence. Her own mother had deliberately condemned her to a childhood of severe emotional starvation and calculated cruelty just to keep her physically breathing. Clara had to make an impossible, highly controversial, and potentially fatal choice. She could quietly destroy the master ledger, forever protecting the ghost of a mother who had abandoned her to absolute monsters. Or she could upload the entire 20-year-old network architecture to the global intelligence grid. Uploading the files would instantly flag this exact physical location, turning her hiding mother into the most heavily hunted woman on the planet, effectively using her own flesh and blood as live, bleeding bait to draw out Julian's remaining loyalists. She did not hesitate for a single second. Clara connected her heavily encrypted Treasury Department terminal to the leather-bound journal, scanning the dense, handwritten pages with rapid, unforgiving mechanical efficiency. She was no longer a traumatized victim seeking gentle comfort or a lost daughter searching for a tearful, loving reunion. She was the cold, calculating apex predator Marcus Thorne had actively trained her to be. She entirely bypassed the standard federal secure servers and broadcast the raw, unredacted financial files directly onto the most heavily trafficked corners of the international dark web. She was actively setting the entire global criminal underworld on fire, knowing perfectly well that the raging flames would immediately and permanently surround the unknown woman who had given her life. The concept of maternal sacrifice is frequently draped in the comforting illusion of pure, selfless devotion, a narrative designed to soften the harsh edges of basic biological survival. We are desperate to believe that a parent's love is a protective shield, an impenetrable barrier against the cruelty of an unforgiving world. However, true survival rarely affords the luxury of gentle choices or moral purity. Sometimes, the most profound act of protection is an act of utter devastation, a calculated abandonment that leaves the child broken but breathing. Recognizing this dark truth forces us to abandon our childish craving for a warm embrace and accept the cold, metallic reality of our existence. To step into your true power, you must stop weeping over the painful methods of your salvation. You must recognize that the deepest wounds inflicted by those who loved you were simply the agonizing price of admission to the battlefield of your own life. The encrypted upload progress bar hit 100%, sending the massive, devastating data packet out into the unforgiving digital ether. The heavy, oppressive silence of the ruined apartment was suddenly shattered by a sharp, incredibly jarring sound. A dusty, rotary landline phone resting on the chipped kitchen counter began to ring. The shrill, mechanical bell echoed like a desperate scream in the dark, claustrophobic room. Clara slowly walked toward the kitchen, staring down at the completely obsolete plastic device. She picked up the heavy receiver and pressed it against her ear, hearing the ragged, deeply uneven breathing of an older woman who had just realized her 20-year exile was permanently over. The ragged breathing on the other end of the line steadied into a calm, chillingly familiar cadence. "You uploaded the ledger," the older woman stated, her voice entirely devoid of maternal warmth or panicked desperation. It was the precise, calculating tone of a chief financial officer analyzing a hostile corporate takeover. Clara gripped the heavy plastic receiver, feeling a strange, hollow echo in her own chest. "I burned your ghost town to the ground," Clara replied smoothly, watching the flashing red lights of the server terminal reflect off the cracked kitchen tiles. "Julian's remaining kill teams are tracking the digital signature right now. You have less than 5 minutes before they breach the perimeter." The line clicked dead. Clara did not lower the phone immediately. A soft rhythmic creak echoed from the dark hallway outside the apartment door. The heavy brass deadbolt slowly turned, unlocking from the outside with a master key. The wooden door swung open to reveal an elegant, silver-haired woman wearing a tailored charcoal trench coat. She did not look like a terrified fugitive who had spent 2 decades hiding in the industrial slums. She looked exactly like an older, deeply hardened reflection of Clara herself, moving with the same silent, predatory grace. Evelyn stepped into the cramped room, her piercing blue eyes instantly locking onto the shredded remains of the custom wedding dress scattered across the rotting floorboards. Evelyn did not rush forward to embrace the daughter she had abandoned 28 years ago. She simply nodded approvingly at the unconscious mercenary tied up in the corner. She walked calmly toward the kitchen counter and placed a small, heavy titanium drive next to the obsolete rotary phone. "The ledger you just broadcast to the dark web was merely the transaction history," Evelyn explained, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room. "This drive contains the direct algorithmic access codes to drain Julian Croft's final, heavily fortified emergency reserves. You did not just expose him, Clara. You are going to bankrupt the entire global syndicate." Clara stared at the metallic drive, realizing her mother had orchestrated this final reunion not as an apology, but as a heavily weaponized inheritance. Evelyn walked past her daughter, moving toward the rusted fire escape window. "The kill teams are already entering the main lobby," Evelyn said softly, peering down into the rain-soaked alleyway. "Marcus Thorne and his Treasury Department strike team are waiting 3 blocks east. If you leave through the roof access right now, you will vanish into the storm before Julian's men ever reach this floor." The young operative did not reach for the titanium drive immediately. She looked at the woman who had traded her to a monster just to secure a tactical advantage. Clara asked her mother if she had ever felt even a single moment of devastating regret during those 28 years of silent exile. Evelyn paused, her hand resting on the rusted window frame. She turned her head slightly, her profile illuminated by a distant flash of lightning. She whispered that regret was a useless luxury for the weak, but pride was something she felt tonight, watching her daughter become the exact weapon the world feared. Evelyn reached inside her tailored trench coat and pulled out a heavy, military-grade detonator. She had rigged the entire dilapidated apartment building with high-yield incendiary explosives decades ago, patiently waiting for the exact night Julian Croft would inevitably send his executioners. She was not planning to run. She was planning to drag the entire criminal hit squad straight into hell with her, using her own life as the final, inescapable spark. She ordered Clara to take the drive and leave immediately, refusing to allow a single moment of sentimental hesitation to ruin a perfectly executed financial assassination. Clara grabbed the titanium drive and slipped it into her tactical jacket. She did not say a tearful goodbye or offer a futile gesture of forgiveness. She respected her mother's terrifying sacrifice far too much to insult it with polite societal pleasantries. Clara sprinted toward the heavy apartment door, bursting into the dark hallway and taking the concrete stairs toward the roof two at a time. The sound of heavy tactical boots echoed loudly from the lower floors, blending seamlessly with the violent thunder rolling across the Chicago skyline. She kicked open the rusted roof access door, stepping out into the freezing, torrential downpour just as the building beneath her violently shuddered. The explosion was absolute and deafening, a massive shockwave of pure thermal energy that instantly vaporized the fourth floor of the decaying brick monolith. Clara was thrown forward onto the wet gravel of the adjacent rooftop, the blistering heat washing over her back like a physical blow. She slowly pushed herself up to her knees, watching the towering inferno illuminate the dark, weeping city. Julian's elite kill teams, the physical ledger, and the brilliant, ruthless architect of her entire tragic existence were all permanently reduced to a mountain of glowing, silent ash. She stood up slowly, the heavy titanium drive pressing securely against her heart. She was completely alone in the world, entirely free from the suffocating ghosts of her past, and heavily armed with the digital keys to an unguarded empire. The pursuit of justice often demands a terrifying alchemy, transforming the fragile innocence of the victim into the cold, calculated ruthlessness of the executioner. We are universally taught to believe that surviving profound trauma requires a gentle, emotional healing process, a desperate return to the soft light of societal morality. Yet, true liberation is rarely found in the quiet halls of forgiveness. It is frequently forged in the searing heat of absolute destruction, demanding that we willingly burn down the twisted architectures of our own history to ensure the monsters can never rebuild. Blood and lineage are not sacred bonds. They are simply biological accidents that must sometimes be violently severed to protect the future. To truly break a generational cycle of orchestrated cruelty, one must become a solitary force of nature, completely accepting the heavy, isolating truth that ultimate freedom is a kingdom built entirely upon ashes. The most profound act of kindness you can offer a corrupted world is the unwavering willingness to watch it burn.